Good afternoon and welcome back to NCIA's Industry Essentials Educational Webinar Series, our premier digital educational platform featuring a variety of interactive programs to provide you timely, engaging, and essential education when and where your team needs it most. My name is Brian Gilbert, the Deputy Director of Events here at NCIA, and as always, I'm very excited to welcome our valued members to this month's edition of NCIA's Fireside Chat with our government relations team today. If you're just joining us, please stay on the lookout for housekeeping and orientation instructions to be relayed via the chat window, so we're not taking up any more valuable time with routine info. But if you do have any questions on how to participate in this virtual event, don't hesitate to reach out to myself or my colleague Brooke Gilbert via a direct message at any time. Now, let's get this show on the road. As I'm sure you all know, in 2018, Canada became the second country in the world to formally legalize the cultivation, possession, acquisition, and consumption of cannabis and its byproducts. Today, Mike and Michelle will take a deep dive with our panel into lessons learned from Canada, including ways to reform laws, spotting red flags, and crafting regulations. We have a lot of information to cover and a very important topic to explore, so let's not waste any more time. To kick things off, I'd like to welcome Michael Correa, the Director of Government Relations here at NCIA, to the virtual stage to kick things off and introduce today's panelists. You can take it away from here, Mike.
Hey, thank you, Brian, and welcome everybody. This is going to be a really wonderful webinar. I'm excited. One, it's springtime. Two, I just got my first COVID vaccine shot. And three, baseball starts tomorrow. So exciting times. But outside that, you know, we have really wonderful speakers on today's webinar. I'm not one to do 15 minutes of introduction, so I'll give a quick introduction. And looking forward to the discussions. We have Michael Gorenstein, Executive Chairman, Kronos Group. We have Deepak Anand, Chief Executive Officer, the Material Ventures. We have Omar Khan, Senior Vice President of Corporate and Public Affairs, High Tide. We have Nathan Meissen, Chief Executive Officer at Diplomat Consulting, and we have Robin Rabinovich, VP of Strategy at Thrive Cannabis. And one, looking forward to a wonderful discussion today. And when for years, when I talk about cannabis legalization, I like to use the analogy of the dog chasing the car. And the dog finally catches the car and says, now what? And what I think about is the day after we legalize cannabis in America, what happens? Now what? What do we do? And I don't want to get to a place to where we spend years trying to figure out how to do this right. I want to ask the questions ahead of time. I want to learn the lessons that other states, other countries have already done. So when we do eventually legalize, we're going to hit the ground running and we don't make as many mistakes. Now, another thing I want to talk about is there are a lot of advocates out there that look at this issue and say, who are comfortable with just decriminalizing, descheduling cannabis and treating it like any other commodity. I live in DC right now. It's legal to grow it. It's legal to consume it. I can give it to my friends, but there's no legal means to sell it. I don't think that's a wonderful model. I don't think America is going to buy into that. We're going to need strong regulations. We're going to need strong rules. We're going to do this right. And for a middle America to accept legalization, they need to be comfortable with this. And that talks about testing, it talks about pesticides. You know, the soccer moms who are going to consume this on a Friday night want to have the same experience the next Friday. How do they do this? But what about THC? Other things, how do we regulate this? How do we roll this out? The end goal of all of this is to allow the illicit market to shrink and a tax and regulated market to thrive. And so all we have to do is look to the north to see an example of what's happened over the past couple of years, learn from some of the experts. And so our policymakers in DC can actually do what's right and learn some of these lessons. So Michael Gorenstein, Executive Chairman, Kronos Group, thank you for coming. I know you have a time constraint. You're going to be around only for about 15 or 20 minutes and you got to go. So I'd love to ask you a couple questions starting out. Thank you for coming. But first of all, tell us about the greatest, I guess, misconceptions Americans may have about the Canadian cannabis market.
Sure. Thanks for having me. Pleasure to be here. Look, I think that it's always tough to answer biggest misconceptions because I think views of Canada are, all over the place. But I do think that, one common belief is, Americans go and you see Colorado, you see California, and you see this kind of thriving consumer market that is really needing a little bit more regulation, but you can see it working. You can see the progress in Oregon and Washington. You see a lot of small businesses having the opportunity to build brands, to have stores, to creative people being able to put their own kind of ideas out in the world. And you see how that starts taking away from the guy on the corner with a Ziploc bag and makes you actually want to go to a legal tax market. And so you have that image in your mind when you think of Canada, but it's actually quite different. It couldn't have gone, when you compare to a US state, it couldn't have really gone worse as far as what the regulatory rollout is. You've got plain packaging, so things look extremely commoditized. You've got really difficult access to products when you think of bringing new products to market and the speed of innovation. Given the amount of capital that's been poured into Canada, with the regulatory set is actually really held back on being able to bring unique and differentiated products. You've got a government really sitting as the middleman distributor, which adds pretty heavy cost differences. So ultimately, for innovative formats, for things like edibles, for vapes, it's really difficult to compete with an illicit market. And I think that's really tough because it's an area where we talked about food as something that, hey, like make it just regulate the commodity. There needs to be a lot of safety regulations. There needs to be a lot of things. When you have more complex products beyond flower, I think that's important. And in Canada, you're seeing a lot of struggles there. And I think we could go into details on that, but potency limits actually, there's a lot of things that come from that, which makes it difficult to get the products on market.
That's one of the things we do want to go into detail about that. But you brought up a good point. I look at this, and as we go to legalization and taking this out of the illicit market, we need to create a structure where entrepreneurship can thrive and businesses can actually make money on this. And I'm just going to be totally honest with you. I don't want to have a market where it's the DMV, where I'm going to the DMV for my cannabis. But with that being said, there needs to be regulations. There needs to be a lot of regulations. But those regulations need to allow entrepreneurship, and they now need to allow small businesses to function and to thrive, or else they're not going to get involved. And the illicit market is never going to get away, because let's be honest, you have to be able to make a dollar at the end of the day to thrive and to allow businesses and to provide products. And our opponents will say, oh, it's big bad industry trying to sell products to America. No, it's the American consumer that are demanding certain products, whether that's an edible, whether that's lighter THC or heavier THC, and the industry is providing that. So I just wanted to say that Michelle, my wonderful deputy, Michelle Rutter-Freeberg, who does everything to make me look good, I just want you to be able to jump in and ask a question.
Yeah, Mike, and thank you both, Mike, for that. That goes perfectly to what I wanted to ask you, Mike, about next, which is about sort of like a free market concept here. And you mentioned or touched on there in your opening statement about marketing in Canada, or really the lack thereof. And that's something that here in the States, to be frank with you, I had no idea about until very, very recently, that there really isn't any marketing. So can you tell us about, as a company, what is that like as a struggle? How do you bring new products to market? How does that hurt innovation? And, also how does that, how are companies communicating to their consumers without that ability?
Look, there are ways to do it. I sometimes think one way to describe the Canadian regulations is if you think about the worst parts of the pharma, alcohol, and tobacco regulations, and you put that together into one giant regulatory package. That's sort of what we have. So there are ways that you can communicate with consumers that are already, in store, that have already decided to go to the legal market, how to try to shift them a little bit. But it's very difficult to reach out to consumers that are sort of in the illicit market and try and bring them into the legal market. And I think, when you look at some of the innovations that companies like mine has developed, getting them into market, a lot of times you develop we think about what does a consumer want? What's going to take a consumer, away? How do we deliver something that's sort of next generation? A lot of times we're thinking about for the U.S. market because it's just not possible to get it out, in the Canadian market. Just an example of one thing that makes it difficult. Cannabis consumers tend to also be very environmentally conscious. Just if you look at a cross section of insights, and if you think about what the packaging limits are, there's a cap of 10 milligrams for edibles, right? And if you think about when you go and you shop, if you were to go buy beer and you buy a 6-pack, a 24-pack, what you would have to do with cannabis is go and buy individual cans, right? Individual edibles for each 10-gram dose. And so it's not necessarily that the single format doesn't work. It's just bringing a consumer in and trying to give them something they want. They look at it and they say, why is all this packaging here? I don't want to walk out with a shopping bag of, what should be in a case. It's also more expensive. And that's not money that's going into the industry. It's all spoilage. It's all leakage. It leaves the industry. It doesn't get passed on to the consumer. It doesn't get passed to the government. It's just extra cost. And so, I think the reason for that was meant to be to make sure that people aren't taking too much, but the consequence is it really just, it hampers the growth potential.
Juan, thank you for that. And I do want to ask you sort of a generic question. That is what the whole topic of this webinar is about. Because I know you have to leave soon. And then I want to open it up to everyone to sort of give their 2 thoughts or 2 cents and then reply. So Michael, give your best advice. I don't know if it's lessons learned or the advice that you would give to policymakers, the 1 or 2 or 3 takeaways that are just so important from your perspective that you've seen. And then with that, everyone, I want others to sort of jump in after the response and do the same thing.
Sure. So look, and I've got the benefit, but I started 2 things. I started Kronos Group and I started a fund called Gotham, which is, with over 50 investee companies in US cannabis. So I've seen a lot of different regulations. And ultimately what I think the most important thing is, and what leads to a successful market versus a not successful market, is looking at multiple objectives as a policymaker and balancing those, right? So of course you're going to have, health and safety, you're going to have jobs, you're going to have tax revenue, having a responsible framework is important. None of those objectives can work if the others aren't satisfied. So over indexing to one is, quite difficult. And I think the big thing people miss or underestimate is this is not a monopoly industry. We are competing with a huge competitor in the illicit market. And simply legalizing doesn't mean things will just go well. One of the reasons we're all excited about this is a tax revenue opportunity, job creators and entrepreneurs, is we know that this is a $200 billion industry without legalization. People are using cannabis that's not safe, that's not transparent, regardless of the laws. And so clearly they've been comfortable to use it. And if we don't provide a better experience for them as an industry, they'll stay where they are. They don't need us. We want them to come to us. So I just think making sure that's balanced and understanding that we need to have a competitive legal industry with the incumbents. We're coming in to take market share from the guy on the corner. And that's really important to remember.
Hey, thank you. I know you have to go pretty soon, but let's just go around. Omar, you're top on my computer screen right now, but let's go around. Just thoughts on that, a big sort of takeaway.
Yeah, look, my biggest lesson learned from the Canadian experience is that as governments and policymakers look to roll out their frameworks, they should include an economic development lens for the sector. I think Canada's biggest mistake was to not do that. And the reason Canada didn't do that was because the driving public policy imperatives in Canada had nothing to do with economics. It had to do with social justice and social equity in terms of making sure that a disproportionate number of Indigenous and persons of color were not being prosecuted criminally anymore. It had to do with keeping cannabis products out of the hands of kids, and it had to do with diverting revenue away from organized crime. Those were the stated federal government policy objectives. I think one of the lessons learned is that we do have a strong economic story to tell, despite the fact that the government here hasn't actually embraced the industry from that economic perspective. We do see I think it was reported by Bloomberg, by BNN Bloomberg today, David George Koch, that the GDP contribution for retailers, for licensed retailers and producers in Canada is close to $18 billion. And that is now approaching the cumulative GDP contribution in Canada of the automotive industry, which is I think one of our top 3 employers and industries in the country. So that would be my key takeaway. You know, this industry now employs over 10,000 people across the country. As you're pushing your states to take action, as you're pushing the federal government to take action in the US, make sure that there is that economic lens.
No, I couldn't agree more. Deepak, what about your thoughts?
Yeah, definitely agreed with the comments that were made. I think in addition to the comments that have been made already, I would say the whole socioeconomic aspect is also very important. I think the aspect with respect to bringing in people from the BIPOC community is also something that's very, very important, not just the BIPOC community, but also Indigenous Canadians. I think by and large have been left out from the framework. I think we've seen New York's framework roll out, and I think to their credit, they've done a good job trying to address that issue. I think Canada by and large has sort of, eliminated the whole conversation around BIPOC and sort of Indigenous inclusion into the cannabis industry. So I'd like to see more of that become involved. And then on the regulatory policy side, unfortunately, we've treated CBD, which we all know is a relatively benign molecule, at the same level as THC. And I think that is holding Canadian companies back and Canadians back generally on the global stage. So I'd like to see a policy shift with respect to CBD in particular. Those would be the 2 big things for me.
That's wonderful. Robin, what about you?
Yeah, so I was actually going to speak to CBD. So I'm glad Deepak covered that. I think he covered it great. I think another important aspect to look at, if we could give any advice back to policymakers, is to also have a close eye on inclusion of different size businesses. So very early on in the industry, we saw large vertically integrated companies. We then saw a slight shift in that, introducing micro processing and micro cultivation licenses. But I think it's very important not only to build policies that allow those opportunities, but to stay very close to the individuals operating those organizations to make sure that the barriers to entry that are there to protect us aren't preventing them from having a legitimate space within the framework itself.
And on that note, my job as a lobbyist is to educate policymakers. And so that's exactly, I'm learning from you guys. So I know a big piece of legislation will be hopefully introduced in the next month or so, the Booker, Wyden, Schumer bill in the Senate. And that's going to be an opportunity for us, NCIA and in the cannabis industry in general, to comment on that, of what provisions should be in there. So definitely, Robin, I'm listening, I'm learning, so we can take those and let our policymakers know. So Nathan, like to finish up.
Yeah, thanks for the opportunity. Agree with my fellow panelists. I think a couple things, one building off what Omar said, of that $18 billion of GDP economic contribution to Canada, the estimate is only about $3.3 billion of that is cultivation and retail. So what that means is, and I think we forget about this because we're so hyper focused on cultivation and retail, is the largest people at the table are the traditional economic actors, who are the builders, the construction companies, the panel security companies, and we need them involved in the conversation because it changes the conversation when it comes to lobby, advocacy, and political buy-in, and making people realize that cannabis revenue does make you a cannabis business. That's I think a key facet of the conversation. And I think one of the biggest differences from Canada to the States, which is going to be perhaps where the greatest lessons can be learned, is politics rolls downhill. So the feds legalized, and then they brought it to the provinces, states, to roll down, and then the municipalities got involved. Well, as that transition of political power and influence happened, the roles and responsibilities as well as the benefits were disproportional on the municipalities, but they didn't get any of the money. So I think it'll be very interesting where those lessons are going to be really key when you have a federal system that is going to be layered on a state by state based system with a municipal rollout attached to that. And then the private sector is going to have to react. And I think that's going to be something that America is going to want to pay a lot of attention to on the Canadian frictions between those three orders of government, because it's going to be very, very challenging to see how that works together.
That's definitely from our, federal, state to local municipality. Definitely, it's going to be important. Michael Gorenstein, I know you have to leave. If you have a second for one last question, you have, background, capital markets, finance, investment. So unlike in the US, marijuana companies can be publicly traded and listed in the stock exchange in Canada. How can US companies prepare? What can US companies do from that standpoint?
Yeah, well, look, I mean, U.S. companies can list on, the CSE or on NEO. I think in order to list on NASDAQ or NYSE, and this is not just a regulatory thing, I think the amount of infrastructure that you need is much, much different, because U.S. securities laws, it doesn't get more stringent than that. And I think that there's going to be, there's this belief that the MORE 2.0 Act, or, pick whatever name you want for it, that gets passed, it suddenly everyone just goes from the CSE to NASDAQ like it's nothing. But I think understanding Sarbanes-Oxley, understanding what type of liability you're taking on, what the costs are associated with that, beefing up your accounting systems, making sure that you've got the right infrastructure, or the ERP, MRP, making sure that you have the right legal team. Things are just a lot more stringent, and you need, the consequences for errors are much, much larger. You've obviously got to deal with plaintiff bars. So I think it's not too early to prepare, but also your goal shouldn't just be to get on a big exchange. Your goal should be to capitalize your business so that you can perform best. And, depending on the size, scale, and structure of your business, I think you talk to advisors and you find out, is this going to be a distraction or is this going to help? And, for the larger companies, it's likely something that it's absolutely going to help, but for smaller companies, it might not be the best answer. So I think, I'm not going to give plugs for any advisors out there. I'm sure that there'll be a flurry of them reaching out to every company. But, I think asking those questions and making sure you know what you're getting yourself into is important. And if you can't afford, extra couple $1 million at a minimum in cost per year, I think that there are other routes to do it, but I wouldn't just sacrifice everything to go list on NASDAQ or NYSE.
Well, those are all really, really wise words, I think. And Mike, we so appreciate your time again this afternoon. Thank you for sharing some of your wisdom with us. So really appreciate that.
Sorry.
So with that, I want to transfer over, and Deepak and Omar, I'm looking at you guys through the screen for this next question that I want to ask you guys. And I'm personally really excited to hear the answer. And so we occasionally, hear concerns, certainly here in DC, about legalizing cannabis in the U.S. as it pertains to our international treaties. So thinking about things like the Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs. But Canada is a G7 and a G20 nation. So I'm curious to hear from you guys, have Canada's international treaties, UN treaties, whatever you want to, talk about, have those impacted legalization at all there? And I specifically also would love if one of you guys could touch on NAFTA, for instance, thinking about, we're here in the US, we have Canada to the north that's legalized, and, down south in Mexico, that's looking like it might be a possibility soon there too. And so really curious to hear how you think that's going to impact those trade agreements as well.
Deepak, you want to go first?
Sure, happy to just touch base on this. So I think one of the main reasons, we sort of looked at legalization when the conversation was happening at the Senate level. There was very much a discussion around our international policy obligations, and Canada did something that I hope my child actually never finds out about. Is we basically said that we are in principle non-compliance with the treaties, and that's an extremely interesting choice of words. And so what we said to the United Nations, in other words, is we recognize that there are UN treaties that are outdated, in our opinion. We are choosing to kind of not comply with those treaties on the basis that what we're doing is within our borders is from a harm reduction and a public safety approach. And what Canada said in legalization was that one of the main reasons, as was articulated earlier, for legalization, it was we had the highest rate of underage access by Canadians under the age of 19 to cannabis. And so that was a big reason that we used for that rationale. And the UN clearly hasn't come back to us with any sort of negative repercussions to date. There's been a lot of rumors around what may or may not happen, but we really haven't seen any large kind of backlash. In fact, what we saw, about a year ago was the UN itself look at changing and descheduling a number of these treaties and changing the schedule in which cannabis arises. So I think by Canada having done this, and from a G7 perspective, we've opened the door to that conversation at the UN to be able to take place and say, do we want to, on the one hand, penalize Canada for this big bad thing that they've done, or should we actually step back and say that this is not as bad as something like carfentanil? And so it's really opened that discussion up at a high level. Omar, please feel free to add.
Yeah, I'll just add that to Deepak's points. It's one of the reasons the government has been very, very careful in how they message about the economic potential of the industry, particularly with respect to exports. So, when they are talking, when members of our federal government are talking to their international colleagues, they're very clear, as Deepak said, that this was a domestically driven public policy change. So for three very, very domestically focused public policy imperatives, as I discussed before, diverting revenue from organized crime, reducing youth consumption, and protecting public health by regulating the sector.
Nathan, I think you wanted to speak to NAFTA. Can you touch on that a little bit for us?
Yeah, I think that's a really exciting conversation. I think the fact that we now have two of the three NAFTA rolls off the top better than the new acronym of UMSCA. I think it's really interesting that a lot of the parallels between federal regulation in Canada is 80% the same in Mexico. So I think it'll be very interesting to see. But that agreement isn't very old. And could we see Canada and Mexico ask America, as they're going through legalization efforts, to add Canada or add cannabis into the next wave of negotiations as an agricultural product underneath the NAFTA negotiations, the UMSCA negotiations. And I think the way that happens is the advancement of the Farm Act and CBD and other non-psychoactive cannabinoids that are under development in the States. But also Mexico has really adopted that as well, where Canada has lagged behind. So I think there could be an interesting aspect for that conversation to start to come by. And hopefully that creates some political pressure and some safety, because optics matter. So maybe that changes the tenor of the conversation when it comes to the economics that Omar spoke so eloquently about before.
No,
I just wanted to touch base and provide one point of clarification. That I think that the larger conversation that we need to all be having in this applies to Mexico and the U.S. as it does to any other countries is just around the easing of those sanctions and the easing of those treaties with respect to trading of these products, because NAFTA on its own or USMCA is not going to do very much on by itself. In fact, it can't, because it would be in violation of treaties, right? So if you look at medical cannabis, that can be sold and is being sold currently from Canada into the US and into Mexico. That can continue without NAFTA. So I think that the more important conversation before we can have an MCA conversation is just around the conversation with respect to how we schedule CBD, because in Canada we schedule it exactly as THC, and it doesn't matter what NAFTA or anyone else does. We're never going to be able to import it unless it's for medical and scientific purposes only. So we need to be having that conversation in addition to the conversation around the treaties on its own, because in absence of that discussion, there really can't be a NAFTA or a USMCA conversation.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. So federalism was brought up earlier. We have the state, the federal government, the state, the local. I'm originally from California, and when California legalized, they allowed the municipal governments, I guess, to opt out, which I think now, instead of navigating one set of regulations, you have to navigate 50 plus sets of regulations. Who does what? It makes it harder for an industry operator just trying to get their products out to consumers, and all the hoops you need to jump through I do worry about that in America, but I do think that if people don't want this in their backyard, they don't need to have it in their backyard, but we need to be careful on how we do this. I'm just curious, in Canada, can you explain, any of you, the opt-out provisions on how it works, and what have you seen on something like that?
Well, so it depends per province. So maybe I'll take Ontario, which is where I personally am based. It's the largest province, and then Nathan and others maybe can chime in on some of the other jurisdictions. So as Nathan spoke to before, we have a system where legalization across the country was imposed by federal statute, but that statute downloaded the implementation frameworks. So basically, how do you get cannabis into people's hands to the provinces? Provinces are our equivalent of your states. So in Ontario, what the provincial government did was it allowed a one-time opt-out for any municipality. To try and get them to not opt out, they offered some sweeteners on the table in terms of funding for police services and other costs associated with legalization. What we saw was that a lot of the suburban municipalities, very densely populated suburban municipalities that ring the city of Toronto, which is the largest city in Canada, chose to opt out. To the point where for a while, from a population perspective, if you took Toronto out of the mix, the majority of people who lived in this province in Ontario were not in a municipality that allowed for retail cannabis sales. And the reason there is, I'll just be blunt, it's political. Many of these municipalities have high density populations of South and Southeast Asian communities. So if you take, for example, the municipality of Markham, which has decided to opt out, very close to just north of the city of Toronto, almost 80% BIPOC population, predominantly South and East Asian. Similarly with the city of Mississauga, just to the west of Toronto, they've also opted out. There is still a historic stigma within these communities towards cannabis use. And I think a lot of the councils just didn't have the political courage to go in and educate those communities. And I'll be blunt here as well. I think the industry in Canada has done a horrible job of doing outreach to those communities, of employing people from those communities within the industry, of educating those communities, and addressing some of this stigma that really, a lot of it dates back to colonialism and the opium wars. And my advice to you all, as you're talking to your governments at various levels, is to make sure that inclusion lens is front and center as you're going about developing your frameworks. I know the demographics are different from the Greater Toronto Area versus the various states in the U.S. But that has really been something that I think has been a fail here from the industry's perspective, is that lack of education into those communities about stigma.
Just to add to Omar a bit, solely because I am Ontario focused as well. So I'll provide you the little bit of insight that I have just from working with Mississauga, which is one of the largest municipalities that did decide to opt out. I think it's important we also just clarify the actual role and responsibilities that the municipalities actually have, right? So they do have the ability to either opt in or opt out, but what they don't have is any sort of control over where these locations are actually dropped within their municipality. And that was a large concern, at least for the municipality of Mississauga, because they wanted to prevent any sort of one street from just being lined with stores themselves. So just wanted to clarify in what the actual roles and responsibilities of the municipality are, because I think that caused some frustration between the different levels of government as this was implemented.
In Ontario. In Ontario.
Which
is a very different circumstance, because everywhere else it was very different. So,
can I just add one more point?
Please.
Sorry, go ahead. One thing I was just going to really add as an overarching theme to zoom back out a little bit from this conversation is, and I say this often when I meet with cities and municipalities and states, is just because you're not going to regulate and tax cannabis, don't pretend like it's not happening in your jurisdictions, right? I think by banning cannabis in any state, in any city, you're actually doing yourself as a regulator and as a city or a municipality a huge disservice, because now you're taking this and putting it back into the underground, which is the illicit market, where you absolutely have no line of sight with respect to what's happening. So I would, and that's just a common theme. It doesn't matter what the city is, it doesn't matter what the municipality is, it goes across ethnicities. I mean, this is just cross-functional. So that would probably be the overarching, theme and comment back, is saying you might as well tax it and be privy to what's happening and be able to do it in plain sight, as opposed to pretending that it's not happening, because it's happening.
It would be the equivalent of New York just legalizing yesterday, and New York City saying, sorry, we don't want to be part of it. It's just one of those things, because it's such a big part. These cities are such a big part because that's where the consumers are. Michelle.
Yeah, and I think this is a really important issue, talking about diversity here. So I do want to drill down on it a little bit more. And Mike, you just mentioned New York there, and Omar, I couldn't agree with your sentiment more earlier, even when you were talking about Canada, but also looking at the states. The cannabis industry here has a very big diversity issue, has a very big equity issue, and we have to be willing to talk about that and address it. And I think it's wonderful that New York, which I think is the second largest, recreational market in the United States, decided, to legalize cannabis literally just last night. And it is one of the most progressive bills that have ever passed in terms of equity and thinking about diversity and, people of color and all of that. And I think that we need to, again, keep that front of mind. It can't be an afterthought, right? I think we tried that in the early years of legalization, and people tried to make it an afterthought. And I think it's really, really clear, and certainly in our work at the federal level, something that is front of mind for us that we need to address from the get-go, because if you wait to do it later, it either isn't going to happen or it's not going to work out well. So Omar, I don't know if you want to take this one. All of you guys have just gave really wonderful thoughts about this topic in general. But like I said, I want to drill down on it a little bit more and put some numbers to this. I pulled up a statistic that said that, only a really small number of cannabis licenses in Canada are held by Indigenous peoples. And like you said, it's a little bit, different here in the States. But, as of September 2020, there were just 19 Indigenous affiliated, that's right, 19 Indigenous affiliated cannabis companies, which made up a little over 4% of 459 authorized federal cannabis licenses issued by Health Canada. So, Omar, you talked about how businesses and government haven't done a good job at addressing this. Is that changing? Are people trying to address this, whether that's from companies or from, their governments, whether that be federal, like we said, state, municipal? How is that going right now? Are we starting to see that become more of a part of the conversation?
It's changing, but not fast enough. I did a quick scan the other day of some of our largest LPs websites. I won't name names. Materia is not one of them. You guys are all good, Deepak. But I think I saw on senior executive teams the percentage of their teams that were persons of color was like 6%. And that's a problem because the percentage of the Canadian population is 25%. And the percentage in large cities like Toronto, where I live, and Vancouver, where Deepak lives, is over 50%. So that is a huge problem, and it's creating political problems for the industry. So, for example, a lot of those problems or challenges that Michael from Kronos raised earlier, one of the reasons it's hard to get a political ear from decision makers is because I'm going to circle back to the South and Southeast Asian communities in particular. They are heavily concentrated in what we would call swing electoral districts. I think you could probably call them the same thing in the US. So there's a heavy concentration in the districts that all the parties are fighting for. So we're in a situation now where the governing party, the Liberal Party, has said, look, we went out on a limb. No other party was talking about legalization. We did it. We don't owe you anything, and there's a lot of political risk for us to open up the regulations. So when the party was at the when the party and the government that was at the forefront of legalization sees in their own eyes political risk with going further, that's a problem. And I think part of that issue is if you look at a lot of the senior management teams within the industry, in Canada at least, they're still dominated by VC players, and they're still dominated largely by white males. And I think that creates a blind spot to some of these issues.
Hey, and I'm just sorry about that. I'm just reading some of the Q&A, a lot of good Q&A coming in here that I think we can get to. I want to talk about economics. As Congress starts debating this, one important issue is going to be taxation. How we tax it, where we tax it, because that's a big determinant on the total, the price, the outcome, and how quickly consumers will be able to participate in this market. How has the tax structure sort of been levied or work in Canada, and what has that done for like prices in general overall?
I'll go on this one as somebody who's done a lot across the country in this regard. I think the three orders of government is something that needs to be taken into consideration, just because this was so new that everybody made sure to take their pound of flesh. There's so many great, wonderful examples of horrible statistics in this sector. So one of the most expensive licenses for a business license to get in Vancouver, for example, is a restaurant license, which is about $2,250 for a business license for a restaurant. A cannabis retailer in the municipality of Vancouver is $34,000. So you can see the disparity at a municipal level. The province of Alberta, between regulation or from the provincial regulator and combining the federal excise process, charges 41.3% taxation on top of cannabis in advance of it even making it to the shelves. Now, when the mandate of this was to displace the illicit market, who pays none of those costs, we have to realize that consumer choice is quite often made in consumer packaged goods by pricing. And we are definitely not at a price comparative level because of the three orders of government making sure that they're all taking their consideration. That's where I think the benefit is twofold, in the fact that we're still not fulfilling the mandate of the original cannabis legalization for the displacement of the illicit market, but we're also not considering the opportunities for us to unlock the economic growth potential, not only domestically, but internationally as well. Specifically, when you take in the largest share of businesses are not cultivation and retail. They're lawyers, accountants, so on and so forth, and they're easier to export to the world. But we're not even getting that conversation. And the taxation regime is something that is under discussion. We're very lucky on twofold quick things. The Cannabis Act in Canada actually embedded a 3-year review of the act, which is October 17th of 2021, which means this year we're actually leading a review of the cannabis sector to Health Canada and the government about what changes should and could be made in the sector. We're helping lead that underneath the Canadian Chamber of Commerce, as well as other groups that are continuing to drive that conversation. And I think the other one that's interesting that should be taken in, Health Canada has actually heard this as a consideration and launched an RFP process 2 weeks ago, where they're actually quantifying what the true cost of taxation and cost of entry for a business is at a provincial, or at a municipal, provincial, and federal level, which would be the first time that we'll have that data available for us to do comparisons to, natural affiliations between cannabis and alcohol, for example. I have a strange feeling, just haphazard guess, that it does not cost $34,000 for a cannabis retail license in Vancouver, or for a liquor license in Vancouver. So it'll be very interesting when the government is the people that are providing apple to apples for comparison.
Hey, Robin, I see you shaking your head a lot. I know you want to jump in.
I was just going to, for the individuals, maybe explain how excise tax is done here in Canada. And that's solely because we're seeing a lot of conversations come up into play, whether it's putting a potency additional tax on higher potency products. So I just thought I'd give everyone kind of a very quick, non-detailed, explanation of how excise works, because you can quickly guys know right now how it's done differently based on the category of product that you're producing. So for dried product, it's done on a weight basis, unless the retail price is so high that it kicks in another calculation that's called ad valorem, and it's the higher of the two. When you're talking about any sort of derivative product, that's when it flips to a per milligram conversation. So the tax comes from how much potent cannabinoids are in that actual product, and that drives kind of the value behind the excise tax. There are 4 provinces in Canada that have an additional adjustment that comes on top of that. So there is no mandated federal excise program that is similar across all provinces, and there are some uniqueness that comes into play with each province that we're probably going to see at the state level as well. When just bringing in some of the pros and cons of taxing high potency dried flower products, there's been some talks in the news that may incentivize individuals from not solely focusing on the THC of that product. Here in Canada, we see that consumers under the dry flower category are still very much driven to high potency products depending on the THC level on that label itself. So individuals, when they're talking about this being a possible shift from that type of buying behavior, I just have particular concerns. Is that going to push people back into the illicit market? People know what they're looking for. They're looking for that high level, high quality product to be offered in the legal framework. And I personally think there's different ways to go about that to educate the user on why high THC may not always equal quality, or that there's other components that drive the quality discussion. So just know that that was a really hot topic in the news these days, so wanted to bring it up.
No, I just remember when Washington State legalized, it was sort of tax on top of tax on top of tax on top of tax. It's unworkable, and they had to change that. I also am old enough to remember cigarette taxes. There was such a discrepancy between Virginia taxes and New York City taxes, and there was actually people would traffic in cigarettes, trafficking in cigarettes. That's what happens. We know how important or we know what effect tax rates have on the end behavior. And Michelle and I were on the initial Zoom call with Senator Schumer, Senator Wyden, and Senator Booker when they were talking about their ideas. And I was very excited when Senator Wyden mentioned possibly having a 2-tiered tax system for smaller businesses and then for larger, which I think is very important. I like where he's going with that direction, because we do need to have a tax system that allows for these small businesses to thrive and allow for people to participate in that. That was me on my soapbox, Michelle.
Well, we are getting close to the end of our hour, so I'm going to pose this question to all of you guys so that we can leave at least a couple of minutes left for a couple of the Q&A questions that have been posed to us. So I would love to hear from all of you guys. Deepak, I want to hear from you first. I feel like it's been a minute since I've heard from you, so I'm gonna target you first. But I'll drop a link here in the chat feature for our friends who are joining us today. There was a report card done on cannabis in Canada, and none of the areas received an A grade. There were 3 D ratings, and I can personally say my parents would not have liked if I came home with these grades on my report card. So 3 Ds in cannabis amnesty, medical patient access, and research development and innovation. Would love to hear from you guys. Do you agree with the scorecard? What do you disagree with? How can the grades in some of these areas be improved? I love this because I think it's like a great, clear visual, and it's really easy for people to understand. But would love to hear what you guys think is, right and wrong with this.
Yeah. So, first of all, I'd like to kind of bring this conversation back a little bit. So I think it's, what Canada has done in becoming the first G7 country to legalize cannabis is a monumental task. And for those of us that live in Canada, we know full well that we're not really known on the international stage for anything except hockey and now cannabis. So, for us to have made that change is a pretty monumental step. When you look at a regulator like Health Canada and the bureaucracy in which they operate, this is a monumental task for them to have happen and action. So, notwithstanding those comments, of course, there are a number of challenges. I think, we said very early in the legalization process that this is going to be a process. This is not an event, right? October 17th of 2018 doesn't arrive and then cannabis is legal and you're done, right? This is always going to be a process. And I think it's very important to understand that we as industry need to hold the regulator responsible for a number of things that need to change. And I think the industry generally needs to hold the regulator with respect to what needs to change. So having said that, is the system perfect? I would say it's far from perfect, but I think that it's been a pretty important step, and I don't think anyone cannot acknowledge it, that on the international stage, Canada has done a phenomenal job with respect to this process that we've embarked on and the conversations that we've now opened up. Having said that, yes, I definitely agree with a lot of the grades with respect to the way that they've been structured here. We have a number of things that we need to improve. I think first and foremost is the medical cannabis piece. For anyone that knows anything about the history of cannabis in Canada, this didn't happen. The government just didn't wake up and said, we're going to legalize cannabis. That's not how things came about, despite what might be popular opinion now. Patients are taking governments to courts over decades in this country to try and access cannabis and demand access to cannabis. And yet those same patients are the ones that are suffering the most, even post-legalization. So I think taxation and the medical cannabis piece is probably one of the most important things that needs to be fixed. I think generally when I apply this team, given that this is a US discussion as much as it is Canadian, I think in North America, we've done a really poor job calling cannabis as medicine, but not treating it as such, right? So you couldn't go to a pharmacy and access your medical cannabis because it's this other product, this other drug that pharmacists don't want to deal with. Doesn't matter whether in the US or in Canada. So I think that needs to be fixed immediately. So if there's one piece that I'd like to focus on from my perspective, it's definitely the medical cannabis piece and the taxation that comes along with it. For those of us that live in Canada, we don't tax opiates that literally kill people across the streets. So, and we do tax cannabis. So I think that needs to change.
All really wonderful points. That is really, really interesting, Deepak, and totally agree with you. I don't know that I thought about it much, but I do think it's remarkable, like you said, a G720, and maybe that is something that we need to talk about more, because what a feat it has been, clearly, hearing from you guys today. So Omar, Nathan, Robin, anything you want to add on the report card, or we can jump into a little bit of Q&A, but any thoughts on that?
I'll say largely, I think the report card is accurate. I do think what we can be doing more is celebrating, as Deepak said, some of the successes. It is, like you said, it is a monumental achievement to be the first G7 country to move forward. Some of the areas around, expungements of criminal records and whatnot, I actually think will benefit from your new administration taking some action. So, if President Biden is true to his word and does move to expunge past convictions, I can't see our government holding back on that for too long. But, I think we need to celebrate the success. We need to talk more about the amount of people that are now employed in this country. Rust Belt towns that were dying have been saved and have been flourishing over the last few years. We need to do a better job of an industry of promoting that.
My favorite statistic ties into something that Deepak said. I'm very lucky to be involved in some of the international conversations quite a bit. And one of the things that is always amazing is big up to Uruguay, who took the big left. We always forget about Uruguay. So let's give them a little bit of a big up. But I was lucky enough to start my foray into the sector in 2017, when 2 countries on earth were talking about cannabis legalization. As of January of 2021, it's 66 countries around the world that are now talking about cannabis legalization. And the vast majority of those are utilizing Canada's regulatory framework as the basis of their own, because of, and I know it's a little cliche, but the go low and slow mentality that they took to their regulatory framework. Because as we know, as wonks that live around the political space, and I think Canada learned some great lesson from the States when it came to cannabis legalization. I reference Colorado quite a bit, where edibles, where it was like, it's much easier to give something to the citizens than take it away. So create a regulatory framework that's stiff at the beginning that can be lessened over time, so that you're giving people stuff instead of taking it away. And I think that's one of the lessons that we've learned. Now we have to walk the walk and make sure that we do that, so that we don't continue to live in a very restrictive regime. And hopefully the 3-year review of the Cannabis Act allows us to start pushing forward to that. And I think those are really interesting observations that 66 nations on earth. That's crazy. Like
Well,
that's a lot.
You mentioned the change since 2017. When I began in 2013 lobbying, there were no legal states selling. And so just going up to policymakers in DC, we call it the giggle factor. Huh? What are you talking about? And now, and think, I can't even keep up. What is it, Michelle? What would New York be? What are we at now in America?
I think we're 16. It's been a week here in the States,
Yeah.
but I think we're sitting at 16 right now.
Just how much has changed in these past 8 years, how serious it is, how close we are. And the last thing I want is cannabis culture being American, and then we get left behind because every other country in the world realizes this and starts going forward with that. But Nathan, you mentioned regulations. I want to put up, for people who haven't seen, a year and a half ago, NCIA, our great policy department, put together a white paper on adapting a regulatory framework for the emerging cannabis industry, with thoughts of what America needs to be doing and how we need to regulate, and some ideas for policymakers. Because what you mentioned, Nathan, and I mentioned this earlier, for middle America to accept this, and for then politicians follow middle America, they need to be comfortable with this. And how are you comfortable knowing that this is in your backyard, what exactly it means? What does this do for THC and potency and taxation and businesses and youth and driving and testing and all these things that are associated with that? It's going to be really important. But as we're winding down, Michelle, are there some questions in Q&A that are up there that you want to jump into?
Yeah, there's a couple here. I feel like we've talked a lot about some, obviously we talked about lessons learned. That was what the webinar was about, but we've talked about a lot of, I feel like, the negative lessons learned. And so one question here from Eric that I want to pose to you guys is, if you had to pick one aspect of the Canadian cannabis industry that you could magically transfer to the US industry. So I'm hoping this is something good. I'm trying to end us on a good note here. But if you could magically transfer something positive from the Canadian industry to US cannabis industry, or policy wise, whatever that may be, what do you guys think that would be from each of you?
I'll talk about an outcome. We've seen since 2 years, it's been 2 years since legalization in Canada. And one of the worries out there amongst the naysayers was that, this is just going to increase access for kids. We've seen teen consumption in this country fall by almost half since legalization. So if you've got a Congress person or a state senator out there who's a little bit skittish for that reason, point to that fact. I'd be happy to share the stats as well. It's a significant decrease in teen consumption in Canada since legalization.
Well, just on that, I have to say, our a nemesis out there, a prohibitionist, Project Sam. That's the first argument they use about the world's going to be ending. Oh my gosh, kids are going to be doing this. What next? And now we have 8 years of data, and we have Canada, and that's a perfect example. So thank you for that. But others. Robin, Nathan, anyone want to jump in?
Go ahead.
Go ahead, Nathan.
No, I go ahead.
I was just going to talk about, we see different policies being put in place to the different types of products that can be created with different classes of cannabis. And I do think that's something that is really created a lot of innovative products being brought to market. Of course, there are limitations on different materials or ingredients that can be used to create these products, but I do think the overall breakdown of product categories and the different activities that individuals are allowed to do with different licenses does provide a platform that will provide innovative products being delivered to market. So we're continuing to see that push through. That also may have to do with the licensing system, where there is, outside of Farmgate, a disconnect and no guaranteed shelf space or limitations put behind that is really transacted between producers and retailers. But I do think by creating this system and by creating those open classifications for cannabis formats, is that we are seeing some great innovative products being brought to market.
All really, really good points. So with that, we're right at the top of the hour. So we are going to go around. So my screen goes Omar, Robin, Deepak, and Nathan. Do you guys want to just leave us with any closing thoughts before we sign off here?
Yeah, I've talked a lot, so I'll let others jump in.
Okay, you'll make me call on you. Deepak, you're unmuted. I'm going for you then.
Yeah, I mean, look, what I was going to say was, legalization generally, I think people have been very shy to have the conversation. And I think one of the things that needs to happen is this conversation needs to be brought to the forefront. I think one of the things we're looking forward to in Canada with respect to the US is actually US federal legalization, because we've still been hamstrung with respect to banking, with respect to a number of different elements that, because it's the big bad kind of US mentality about legalization, hasn't really fully embraced it. The banks in Canada are afraid of kind of doing business because of the whole, what's going to happen in the US. So as much as, there's things that can be taken away from here, I think we're also looking forward to what's actually going to happen in the US. But I'd say the conversation needs to be opened up on an international stage with respect to UN treaties. And we certainly look forward to the US actually leading that charge in many ways with respect to amending those treaties. So I think there's a lot that actually needs to happen within the US itself that's going to help the international stage. But let's not be shy in having that conversation. I think Canada has opened that door, and we welcome others to take part in that.
Just to trail on to what Deepak said, I also think with US moving into a full legalization framework, that it is going to provide confidence for institutional bankers and traditional funding to come into this market. It has been a limitation. That's why you see individuals go and list in public markets, even though they may not be, a traditional size for companies that are going public. And I think to Mike Gorenstein's earlier point, a lot of people don't think about the cost of being a public company. So I just think, through further validation that this industry, is what it is and will remain to be in the position that it is and take such a leading front in countries' GDPs, that will just continue to open up doors for traditional financing.
I think one of the things that's the most interesting has been the fact that cannabis has now become a differentiator. And I think when we look about a global pandemic where, that has changed the fabric of the world, there's wise people who have always said great crises creates great opportunities. And I think cannabis can be attributed to different level of conversation. We talked about the economic contribution. But when we talk about cannabis, we still primarily talk about retail, cultivation, and ancillary businesses. Cannabis tourism and hospitality, research and innovation, cannabinoidal research. There's 142-ish cannabinoids in the plant, of which we primarily talk about 2 of them. There's different terpenes, flavonoids. We don't know what we don't know. And the fact that, some of us are years in and we're still just scratching the surface while 66 nations around the world are going through legalization. And the fact that Canada helped lead that conversation, where my kids will grow up in a legalized cannabis world where it might be a differentiator for that, is pretty exciting. And I think that's something we should keep in consideration because we still are living what cannabis is in real time.
Well, I know we're getting down to the end and we're going to wind down now. So one, I want to thank all the panelists. This was I'm actually being honest. This was my favorite webinar Michelle and I have done in the past year. I've learned a lot. The panelists were amazing. I know we had a couple regulators on listening in on this. And I'm going to ask everyone on this. I want to take you guys on the road. I want to do this more often and get this message out. So please be available because we are having these discussions with policymakers. And if that is going to be a panel that Michelle and I do at a future, knock on wood, event that NCIA does in person, or another webinar or a stakeholder meeting I want to put together with regulators, something I want to keep having this discussion. Really excited, really appreciate all you guys have done and just taking the time and letting everyone hear your thoughts and the lessons learned. And on that, Brian, take it away.
Thanks, guys.
Oh, I'm on mute. All right. Well, fantastic. Thank you so much, Mike and Michelle, as always, for leading and facilitating such a fantastic, thought-provoking conversation. I would definitely have to agree. This would probably be the most insight that I've gleaned from one of our fireside chats over the past year. So I very much appreciate all of the panelists for taking the time out of their days and the last few weeks to work with you all to facilitate and execute this program for our valued members today. And with that, thank you all so much for participating in another NCIA Industry Essentials educational webinar. A huge thank you once again to the members of our panel for presenting today's session, along with all of our audience members and member businesses, which make our work possible each and every day. I'm really excited to see a follow-up session come out of today's conversation. And if you haven't heard the news, do head to thecannabisindustry.org to see the rescheduled dates for our 3 upcoming in-person trade show and exposition events that are scheduled across this fall. You'll all be redirected to an attendee survey after leaving the meeting room. Please do complete that to gain immediate access to our presentation and recording files. Do note that all NCIA members receive exclusive 30-day access to that formatted video recording that'll first be posted inside of our members-only community, NCIA Connect, and we'll use any outstanding questions that might have been left over from the Q&A segment as discussion points to start a conversation post-broadcast. So stay on the lookout for that to be posted inside of NCIA Connect later this week, and then reshared on NCIA's blog on our Facebook page as well. We'll leave you all, as always, with this end of event credit sequence highlighting the 20+ member businesses that participated in this afternoon session, alongside some lo-fi audio stylings by yours truly. If you don't see your company included, that means that you need to head to thecannabisindustry.org/join following today's session to join the movement for a responsible and equitable cannabis industry. Enjoy. I hope you have a great rest of your week, and we look forward to seeing you all again for the next Industry Essentials educational webinar taking place next week, that Catalyst Conversations on Demystifying Facilities Design. All right, see you all later.